Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this hybrid event of the Illiberalism Study Program at the George Washington University. My name is Marlene. I'm the director of the Illiberalism Studies Program, and I'm delighted to have with us today our dear colleague Takis Pappas, who will be presenting his current research on populism and other types of democracy, a theoretical simplification. And as you will see, it's really a very stimulating discussion that we will be having here today, both online and in the room. Let me say a few words about Takis. Takis is actually a visiting scholar here at GW. He's a political scientist known for his work on populism and liberalism. He's a former professor of comparative politics in Greece. He has also worked at the University of Helsinki in Finland and at the Central European University in Vienna. And he was also a researcher with the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. His latest book, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, was Populism and Liberal Democracy and Comparative and Theoretical Analysis. But he has also been publishing on Greece and Greek populism, and has been also doing a lot of TED-Ed videos on populism, infographic, and comics. So Takis, welcome. We are delighted to have you with us here, the visiting fellows, and I give you the floor for this, as I said, very stimulating discussion on how we want to conceptualize the notion of populism and its relationship with both democracy, illiberalism, liberalism, and autocracy.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Marlene. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to the Illiberalism. Sorry, the Illiberalism Studies Program. Oops, it went off this thing. John, please help here. It's here, so. Okay, sorry about that. Thanks also, besides Marlene, to the Illiberalism Studies Program for having me here. I'm having a great time doing some research on a new book project, and there are some great people here. They give me plenty of feedback. Now, what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to talk about populism and other types of democracy to which populism is related to, and I want to raise some theoretical points, but I want to simplify as well. I want to present them in a simplified way so as to be able to make sense of current realities in a more kind of comprehensive and smart, perhaps, way. So I will begin with terms and definitions. I will talk about some types of democracy. I will offer a typology of political systems, including populism, which I want to be, I want my types to be mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. I will explain what it means. Then I will focus a bit on modern populism as a novel type of democracy, and I will end with conclusions and takeaways. Well, takeaways, basically, the conclusions will be yours. Okay, now let me let me begin by saying that we need theories. We need theories to understand what happens in this world, in this complex world of ours, and in order to be able to explain very complex phenomena. But and this is what I try to do. Actually, I'm trying to build a theory now about how a liberal state can be transformed into an illiberal state. This is the main puzzle in my mind, and this is the main theoretical question I have. But this is, one type of theory. We look for theories. We need theories. But to have theories, we need first to do empirical work. We have to examine our cases, and we have to put them into distinct types, categories. So we have to perform, what we call typologies. We have to build typologies. But to build typologies, we have to have definitions. We have to have clear definitions, which is something not very easy, because definitions depend on concepts. So we need concepts, and a concept is the basic unit in our thinking. We need very, very clear concepts. But to build concepts further up, we need to have, clear terms, clear words. Since most of what we know or what we want to learn is mediated by words, we had better start with establishing a clear vocabulary. And we do not have that vocabulary, okay? So this takes me to terminology. Now, see this. This is the a breakdown, a typology of regimes around the world suggested by the VDEM project, the Varieties of Democracy project, which is a very well-known, very well-respected, very broadly used typology. Now, you will see here that they distinguish all political systems into 4 categories, and 2 of those are democracies and 2 of those are autocracies. Other than that, they use a number of adjectives, and there the game becomes very, very complex, because they go from closed autocracy to electoral autocracy to electoral democracy to liberal democracy. Now, what is the difference between electoral autocracy and electoral democracy, for example, is quite unclear to me, as I suppose it is to all of you. Where would you place Hungary, for example? Is that an electoral democracy or an electoral autocracy? And where would you place the United States? Is that an electoral democracy or a liberal democracy? All of a sudden, it is not clear to us. It should be clear right away. Or take this also very well-known classification by the European Intelligence Unit. They also divide the political world, the political systems into 4 categories: authoritarian regimes, hybrid regimes, flawed democracies, full democracies. And then they break down those 4 categories into smaller categories, subcategories, as you can see from the colors underneath. But I'm asking you, or I'm asking myself many times, what is a hybrid regime? Is that a democracy or a non-democracy? It's not clear, okay, until you go to definitions. But who wants to go to, I mean, it has to be intuitively clear. What is a flawed democracy? Do we know of any flawless democracies? I know of none. And if we want to accept the category of full democracies, why do we break down into 2 subcategories? Half full democracies and full democracies? What is that? I do not understand. This leads me to the first claim I'm going to make in this presentation. This is a big claim. And my claim is that to understand all political systems in the world, we need only 2 terms, only 2 concepts, and their opposites. And those terms are democracy and non-democracy, liberalism and illiberalism. And that, as I will try to show, is enough in order to have a typology, a full typology of all political systems in the world. So let me go with definitions. What is a democracy? How do I define a democracy? A democracy is a political system in which the incumbent party may lose office after elections which are free. That means that any society that is able to overthrow a government and elect a new government through free elections happily lives in a democratic state. That election has not to be fair necessarily. We'll not have that many countries with very fair elections, but that's another thing. So elections have to be free. And this is a very, very solid definition of what a democracy is based on just 1 criterion, okay? And that is very simple, I think. What is a non-democracy? It is a political system with no elections, think of China, or with elections that are not free. Think, for example, of Iran, where you have regular elections every 4 years. Governments go up and down, governments change all the time, but any party that wants to participate in elections in Iran has to be sanctioned by the supreme leader of the country, the Ayatollah Khamenei. So this is not a democratic state. And what happens? Okay, now we have very clear minimal definitions of democracy and non-democracy. What happens with liberalism and illiberalism? Here things become a little bit more complex, but not that much, and more interesting perhaps, because here we have an antithesis. Okay, again, liberal political systems and illiberal political systems have to be considered as antithetical. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we have an illiberal political system, that system has to have 3 characteristics, and only those only those three characteristics can sufficiently describe and define our political system as illiberal. So those are systems in which in which society is divided between two broad camps, if you like, an in-group and an out-group, which may change positions, of course. Okay, so there is a we versus them as a forma mentis, as a cultural issue in society. Politics is highly adversarial and polarized, and there is an ethos of majoritarianism and lack of respect for minority rights. Okay, now, if you have those three characteristics, you can recognize your political system or party or leader as illiberal. All three characteristics are inimical to the idea of political liberalism, as has been explained during the ages from the times of John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith up to John Rawls and other philosophers like Dworkin, Frieden, etc., etc. What are the characteristics of a liberal democratic system? First of all, the acknowledgement that society is not split along a single cleavage, but there are multiple cross-cutting cleavages, divisions in the society: class, race, religion, language, geography, etc. Secondly, that politics has to be moderate. Politics has to seek to achieve what Rawls calls an overlapping consensus. There should be some cooperation, an attempt to bridge over divisions. And this depends on the rule of law, and that is the main means in liberal societies: rule of law and respect for minority rights. That is a liberal state. Now, and if you want to condense even further, you have liberalism in states that are inclusive, moderate, equitable in terms of their institutions, and illiberal states are exactly the opposite: states where you have polarization, oppositional states, polarized and majoritarian. And as I said, there are liberal parties and illiberal parties, and in many countries you have the alteration in power of liberal and illiberal parties. So if that fulcrum works are the elections, then you may have liberal parties and illiberal parties that compete at elections, and they come to power and they change positions into power, etc., etc. This has happened to many countries, including this one. All right. And now, if we combine the two terms and their opposites, we have categories. We have very nice categories of political systems. So when we have democracy, when democracy combines with liberalism, we get liberal democracies. When democracies combine with liberalism, we get illiberal democracies. And when non-democratic systems combine with liberalism, we have non-democratic systems. You can call them autocracies, you can call them many names. I will come to this in a moment. The possibility of having a non-democratic system which is liberal is absurd, of course. It is non-existent, so this box remains empty. And we've done something else so far with those following this logic of definitions, concepts, etc. We have understood democracy now as a binary concept. That's a big step, because we can tell very easily which countries are democracies and which are not. We do not have, we are rid of hybrid regimes, electoral autocracies, electoral democracies, etc., etc. We can tell right away which countries should classify as democracies and which should classify as non-democracies. At the same time, the concept of liberalism is a gradational concept. We can have democracies with more or less liberalism, and we can have non-democracies with more or less illiberalism. Okay? So this works in a nice way if you want to do a typology of political systems, which I'm going to do. And this is my second attempt to say something new here. And here's a typology of political systems, which begins from the overall genus, all political systems in the world. And now, using my terms and my concepts and my definitions and my gradational versus binary understanding of democracy and liberal democracy, I divide all political systems into democracies and non-democracies all of a sudden. And then you can go into each of those two lumps and think about subcategories. So for example, if you think about non-democratic states, you may have, well, I recognize 5 of them, or I distinguish 5 of them: elected autocracies, authoritarianisms, totalitarianism, sultanism, and theocracy. I don't have time to go into them. I mean, I have written some about them. I don't have the time to do that now, so it may pop up in the discussion if you want. But let me go to the other lump, the democracy lump, which is of more interest here. And this also breaks down into 2 subspecies, if you like, smaller categories: liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. I have defined them both so far, but I want to go even further within that sublump of illiberal democracies and distinguish between 2 types of illiberal democracies, which I will call, for lack of better terms, pre-liberal democracies and modern populism. Now, pre-liberal democracies are democracies, states, that at a certain point made the transition from non-democracy to democracy. They have elections, but they have never had, and they do not have, any experience of liberal democracy, of liberal democratic politics, as I described that. Okay, it is the countries about which Farid Zakaria wrote in an article back in 1997 in Foreign Affairs. The title of the article is The Rise of Liberal Democracies, and what Farid Zakaria saw at that time during the 3rd wave of democratization was that many countries around the world became democratic without being able to become liberal. And he mentions a number of cases, about 15 cases, among which he mentions, cases like Bangladesh or Pakistan, Ethiopia, Haiti, Sierra Leone, the Palestinian Authority, some more, Iran, I think, etc., which up to this date, most of those are not even democratic, but they have never experienced liberal democracy. And I have the other category, which is, my research plate. This is what I've dealt with for so many years: modern populism. Those states here, there is another bunch, different category of states, which used to be liberal democracies, but at a certain point in their political histories in recent years, recent decades, they decided to switch to illiberalism. Some of those have gone back to liberal politics, but some of those have stayed there. Okay, I will come to this in a moment. Now, having this typology in mind, you can easily place your countries you live in, the countries you know better on this, and you will realize that it works. So here I have some examples very, very quickly. So electoral autocracies, those are just examples. I mean, I could have more. I have here Russia and Turkey, authoritarianism. Those are dictatorships of the old style, military dictatorships. I have Myanmar and Mali, totalitarianism, China, sultanism, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia, theocracy, Iran and Afghanistan, liberal democracies up at the left, top left, most European societies, Canada, the United States today are liberal democracies. Modern populism, examples Hungary and Poland, and pre-liberal democracies, I have here India and Haiti. I could have put more. Those are just examples, but just to show you how this typology works in a kind of fine way. All right, now I'm coming to the last part of this presentation, which is populism. So it is this lump there, modern populism, which is the topic of my research over the last 10 years or more. As you know, there are many definitions, many approaches to populism, and they're all very good. But if you ask yourself, what is modern populism? Okay, as I've asked myself over the years, I've come up with this notion of that populism is a novel political system, Mind you, I'm talking about, at the highest level, at the political system level of analysis, right? I can go easily down, but I begin from the highest level of analysis, which is, the political system level of analysis. So populism is a novel political system which is democratic but militates against political liberalism. So I have three concepts here, three notions: the notion of novelty, historical novelty, the notion of democraticness, and the notion of illiberalism. And I want to bring them together. And so I produce a minimal definition, which is populism as democratic illiberalism. So I introduced this definition in 2010. By 2012, I think, 2012, sorry. 2013, an article was published for the first time mentioning democratic liberalism as populism in the modern sense. And then in 2014, Orban popularized the term and made it, very sexy. By the way, my article was about Hungary. What a coincidence, right? It was a comparison of Hungary and Greece, post-authoritarian Greece and post-communist Hungary. And there I introduced the term of democratic liberalism as synonymous to populism. Now, last part of my of this presentation, it will be easy, and I will go graphical in a sense, because I want to say something about what populism does as democratic liberalism to liberal democracies. It does a lot, and not all of that is good. So this guy here, this cartoon, he's Elias Montero. Elias Montero is the populist par excellence. He's a fantastic populist leader, whom I, together with my friend Alekos Papadatos, who is a fantastic cartoonist with international career in Europe, concocted a few months ago. We created a little comic about populism, and our main hero was Elias Montero. We gave him a name. He is the leader of a party which is called the Liberal Democrats. As you can see, he has won the elections, right? And what he does after that, Elias Montero, here is, you see him in front of his, his cabinet shortly after election, and he explains to them his notion of democracy. So, and he says, look, guys, I mean, the real democracy is the one that does what the people want and depends only on one interest, the interest of the people. Now, this is not fictional, this text. This is verbatim quotation from Juan Perón. That is the second of the 20 truths, las 20 verdaderas del peronismo, and this is Perón. And then he, of course, in this, mentality of we versus them, polarization, adversarial politics, etc., he may even, make claims like this: for my friends, everything. So they dispense of patronage benefits to their friends, their supporters, against the opposition. For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law. Okay, nice. Now, this is verbatim quotation from another Peruvian populist leader, Oscar Benavides. Okay, and what do they do in terms of the liberal state checks and balances? Here is, for example, the judiciary. My friend Elias Montero believes that justice is a cancerous growth, and then he tweets, judges are out of touch with true people's sentiments, and their opinions are ridiculous, of course, and should be and will be overturned. It reminds you of something, right? This is Donald Trump. And finally, to take one more aspect of that, when, in terms of checks and balances and accountability, which is very important, as we all know, in liberal democracies, when the opposition calls and says that, or accuses Elias Montero that he and his government violate the will of the people, he says, I am the people. What are you talking about? And, democracy does not have to be liberal, he may say to you. The new state that we're constructing in this country is a liberal state. And when the opposition insists, and they may, say that you may come into opposition, he says we cannot be in opposition as the people of our country. The people cannot be in opposition. The nation cannot be in opposition. Verbatim quotation from Viktor Orban. Okay. Now, I'm almost done. So a few takeaways, as I promised. So I've offered a full typology of political systems, especially of democracies, built on definitions that I believe are very clear. Please keep my typology in mind. And if you deal in your work with democracy, democratic backsliding, or democratic revival. Secondly, populism has to be seen as a political system of democratic liberalism, because it is, as I said, the higher level of analysis, and from there you can easily go to lower levels. No problem about that. Beware of populist leaders. Please keep in mind that populism is not just words, feelings, slogans, morality, styles. It is a particular type of democracy, as long as it remains democratic, which is dangerous for those of you or us who stand on the side of liberalism. And finally, once populism comes into power, and we have several cases by now that provide lots of empirical material for us to know, populism damages democracies, liberal democracies, sometimes beyond repair. And finally, please, if you like, you can visit my site at pappaspopulism.com, and you will find lots of materials about resources about populism and democracy, including this very nice comic, which I hope you will enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Takis, for this really great presentation. I love the comics also, and I think you had a really interesting and kind of intellectually stimulating use of this notion and trying to make sense. And I'm really grateful of you for trying indeed to bring clarity and to be very try to work with simple definition. I think one of the big problem of political science, it's this kind of inflation of terminology and of jargon that at the end make that it's really difficult to know what we are talking about. I want to give the floor to people in the room and online. So people who are online, we really invite you to ask questions in the chat. I will then read them to everybody, and I will transfer also the question coming from the room here in person, and I have my own question if we have time. So if you can also introduce yourself, sir. You're first.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pappas, for your interest and expertise in this topic of democracy. My name is Christy. I'm just visiting here. And my question is, we can't deny the challenges to democracy around the world, especially since we are in USA now, and no one can deny that there are challenges. And democracy has been a long experimentation in the USA since the founding fathers brought the practice of this experimentation for about 200 years, and it's a big struggle till what we have achieved right now. And we have seen that democracy is for the people and interest of the people, and since we can't deny that our founding fathers, it was a Christian majority, but we have the first amendment in our constitution. Every religion has been accepted in the country, and in democracy we have the rule of law. And what you see as the challenges to the present democracy in USA, and especially if the president of the USA doesn't have the power, necessary power to govern the democracy in the present situation.
Should I answer one by one,
or
I should? Well, I'm not quite sure what the question you're asking is. I mean, if you're asking me about the present state of American democracy and whether democracy is doing well, I think the democracy is doing pretty well in this country. Liberal democracy, though, has its ups and downs. So we saw that liberalism is about institutions. So let me put it this way. We have democracy, as I said, when we have free elections, and we do have free elections in this country, definitely. Okay, but the thing is, how fair are the elections, and how fair is the government as vis-a-vis the institutions. How fairly are institutions applied in this country? Now, this is a big discussion. I don't want to go into that, and I'm not a specialist on American politics, to tell you the truth. But what I'm inviting you to think about is not about democracies and democratic backsliding. I do not think that the number of democracies declines dramatically in our world. What I think, however, is that the number and the quality of liberalism is on recession, declines. And we saw that in this country with, institutions and checks and balances related to the judiciary, to public debate, to the press, to the rule of law, etc., etc. So my emphasis is on liberalism versus illiberalism, not that much on democracy versus non-democracy.
Yes, sir.
I'm Alec. I'm Hungarian. Very interesting to me. I was wondering what you think are good avenues for institutions like the European Union and NATO, for example, to strengthen liberal democracy and either prevent or slow down democratic backsliding, especially within their blocks, but maybe around the world too.
Mm-hmm. Listen, I think that when you have a process from liberalism to illiberalism, as you had in your country, I think, and in my country as well. I mean, I come from Greece. We had, our share of illiberalism in the past. So when you move from a point A to a point B, from liberalism to illiberalism, okay, the obvious solution is to go back, to move back from B to A. Now, to do that, you have to have some liberal leadership that will take you there. So you have to have strong parties, you have to have strong liberal ideas, and a liberal project to project to the people, because the people are there as voters. They have to vote for you. Remember, we're talking about democracies here. So I think that what happened, for example, in Hungary in the last elections this year was that the opposition did not stand up to the task. So as it was expected by several people and, the pollsters, etc., etc. So if the opposition was of a better, quality, perhaps Orban would have lost power, as it happened in this country in the last elections, as it happened in my country, for example, in 2019 elections, as it happened in Brazil this year, for example. So what we see here, and this is my past, actually, this is what I'm trying to address in my work, is the role of leadership. So because populism always requires, successful populism always requires a leader with, Montero Elias, right? Elias Montero, or leaders like him, who behave in the same way. There's a playbook there. But this requires liberal leaders who will play out their own playbook. So that is and this is what we saw in Hungary this year, actually. We saw an opposition that began in a nice way, forcefully, they united, but then they split at the end, they could not perform. So leadership is the key factor here, I believe.
Maybe we take some, we have questions also online, and I will be reading one. Thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. It's quite impressive how such a complex and varied phenomenon can be articulated in these relatively simple terms. However, I have one question regarding your definition of democracy. What would you say about the critique that this definition fails to recognize as a possible shift from democratic to non-democratic actors? For in many cases, we can't surely know whether or not incumbents will accept their loss in an election. Thinking, for example, this year of the election in Hungary, can we be sure that Orban would have accepted a loss? And so if I can add on that, if you could articulate on how the concept, when you have this great graph and the bubbles, how temporality plays a role and how we move from one concept to another one, right? How do we take into consideration, and it's a really kind of conceptual aspect, the existence of this notion and the fact that you can move from one to the other in terms of temporality and back and forth, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for this question. This is a great question. So let me combine my answer to try to answer both questions, yours and the person in the audience. Definitely. I mean, and I should have mentioned that the typology here is very dynamic. So we have to think, if we think about this typology over years, over decades, over time, we see nations changing positions all the time. So a country may move from liberalism to illiberalism, and from illiberalism to populism, and from populism to autocracy, any kind of autocracy. So we can think about, take my home country, Greece, for example, okay? Back in the 50s, it was an illiberal democracy without liberalism. Then it becomes liberal in 1974, okay? It was a liberal democracy, becomes a member of the European Union. Then 1980s, the country becomes illiberal, becomes populist, okay? By the way, it was the first government in Europe, first populist government, first populist party to win office in Europe. Before 1981 in Greece, we do not have any populist governments in Europe. Think about that. That's the novelty of the concept. So after that, after the 1980s, Greece becomes liberal again, okay? Then becomes populist again under Syriza and Anel, and now it is liberal again. So it's a very dynamic process of countries. Countries, you know, change governments, and the governments may be of different types. So, which brings me to the point when a government loses the elections and declines, you know, refuses to hand over power, then it's not a democracy any longer at this point, because they have to stay there by force, by power, by violating the law, not the rule of law, but law, but the, you know, the fundamentals of a democratic state, freedom, that is. So the country becomes non-democratic. That's as simple as that. So if we imagine this scenario of Orban losing the election, which he didn't lose, and the opposition considered, right? They accepted their defeat. So if we think the scenario of Orban or any Elias Montero not being willing to hand over power after a defeat, then this country is not democratic any longer. As simple as that. And it passes overboard.
Sorry, we have other question. I try to.
The same would have happened in this country, for example, if, you know, things went terribly bad. Yeah.
We have another question from the. Sorry.
And by the way, since I remember that, a perfect example of that, of how a country may move from one type to another, is Venezuela. Venezuela, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, was a liberal democracy. It was the most liberal democracy, the better liberal democracy, the best quality liberal democracy in Latin America under the Punto Fijo agreements of 1957. Chavez comes into power in 1998. The country becomes authoritarian. Okay, Chavez dies, passes away. Power passes to Maduro. Maduro becomes an authoritarian leader. And today, Venezuela is not a democracy. I mean, it's an elected democracy, elected autocracy in my classification. So there you see very, very clearly a country that moves from liberalism to populism to autocracy. Okay.
We have another question coming also from our online audience, a short question. Does your definition of illiberalism simply replicate the widespread definition of populism?
What is the widespread definition of populism?
I don't know. I guess
I know something like 30 definitions of populism. I mean, I have written them down somewhere.
But maybe you could comment here on the this overlap between all the literature on populism and your definition of democratic illiberalism. Do you think that there are ways? I mean, do you think all this literature on populism still makes sense? Should be renamed democratic illiberalism? I mean, how do you articulate this kind of body of literature?
Yeah, sure. No. All of those definitions depend on empirical work, which is very rich material over years. But look, I think that I will answer in two or three ways. Three ways actually. I think that my definition is truly minimal definition, since it contains only two characteristics, two core characteristics of populism, that is the combination of democracy and illiberalism. So that is, we cannot get anything more minimal than that. Secondly, this definition elevates populism to, as I said earlier, to the highest level of analysis. So it has the capacity to make you think about populism at the systems, at the political system level of analysis. And third, as such, it subsumes, it absorbs, in a sense, most other definitions, which are about discourse, symbols, styles, words. What else do you have there? So all of those definitions are good, but they are subsumed here, because when you define your illiberalism, for example, as we versus them, polarization, majoritarianism, all of those are elements that are subsumed in the word, in the term illiberalism. They are there. And democracy also has a number of characteristics. Now you go into, you become more and more abstract. You begin from, concepts, a number of concepts, and then become more and more abstract. And then you come up with a minimal definition. So all of the other definitions are very fine, and they cannot be, rejected. Why should they? But this definition absorbs all the other definitions just because it is minimal.
Mm-hmm. Very good, thanks. Julian, sorry, we have other people. Julian.
Yes. Hi, Julian Waller. So we've talked before. This is fantastic. I really like the binary concept with regime type, especially. My question comes with you create a 4x4. The 4x4 has a nil for non-democratic liberalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't fit with my understanding of the empirical record in terms of sort of like a liberal authoritarianism, things like that. Obvious countries that come to mind are Singapore, which have multiple cross-cutting cleavages, moderation/overlapping consensus, and rule of law and minority rights. In fact, very strong affirmative action program, pillarized minority rights regime, which is also obviously an electoral authoritarian or electoral autocracy. So I'm just wondering why it's nil. Is there a reason why all the liberal authoritarian regimes that pop up, or authoritarian liberalism, which has a background in earlier thinking in the 20th century, as well as, if we go back a little further, 19th century regimes, which are often not recognizably democratic in terms of free and fair elections, but they're sort of competitive, but there's pluralistic elements to them. I think the UK prior to suffrage reforms. Just wondering why that's a nil category, because that doesn't jive with what my understanding of what you mean by liberalism is.
Interesting that you mentioned that, because in my previous work, actually my book on populism, I have populated that empty cell now with Singapore.
Okay.
Yeah, but I've changed my ideas. I do not think that Singapore is democratic, based on new knowledge. So I do not classify that any longer as a democracy, but I use Singapore. But do you have any other examples other than Singapore? Because you see, it is hard, because Singapore, I know Singapore, right? But, and if you go to my, 2019 book, you will see Singapore there, because I have, this 2x2, and Singapore is there as the only exception. Okay, that verifies it. But I'm not quite sure about that.
Yeah, we can talk later.
Of course. I'm not looking at the 19th century. I'm looking at modern types.
Sure.
So I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to corporatist regimes, interwar years, etc. I don't do that. Of course, I mean, if you go back, you can find it. But liberalism, and again, thanks for mentioning that, because this gives me the opportunity to say that my interest is in post-war states, okay, around the world, because liberalism and liberal democracy is a new type of regime. I mean, the beginning of liberal democracy is 1945. So I don't go back. I mean, we could go back, but I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist, and I'm trying to solve, recent political life, puzzles. But you've got a point there. But again, if we take it up to our own years, more recent decades, we will not find this type of, non-democracy and liberalism.
Yeah, I think Singapore, Malaysia.
I do not know Malaysia. I cannot talk about Malaysia. But
anyway, there's reason
but
there to take
Singapore, I mean, I'm intrigued by this case myself. But
If I can be provocative, EU Commission,
the European Union.
some element of the European bureaucracy.
Not
I don't know, just opening the.
I know.
provocative
It is not.
aspect
It is
to
not.
consider.
It is not a state, for good or bad.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
not a state.
Good. Let's collect. So, sir, back to you, and then I think we had a. So, if you want.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pappas. My point is, we have in America President Biden, and we can't deny that our constitution is at risk. And for example, when some regime takes over the country, abolishes democracy, and the constitution is abolished, First Amendment is scrapped. There is no rule of law, and citizens are divided according to the races as voting power. And do you think when President of the USA doesn't have the power to control the govern the country, and what is the future? I think we have a
Very short.
and the next either it may be President Trump or whoever comes, it will be an end of democracy in USA, and maybe for 200 years we won't see any democracy because
Okay,
what we are-
so we need. It should be very short because we have like 10 minutes left.
Perhaps you're too much afraid about that. I mean, democracies do not die very easily. So I do not think that this democracy will die as you are afraid
we
of.
don't want to die. America is
Sir,
an example.
it's
Yeah,
not
we
a
can-
dialogue.
We can take that
yeah.
later on. But as I said earlier, my interest here is not about the future of democracy in America. Democracy will stay here. It is about liberalism. I mean, what is the degree and quality of liberalism that you have in this democracy or in other democracies around the world?
Mhm. There was another question you had. Yeah, you said so on Hungary.
okay,
If you had, I think you wanted to go.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up and ask you what you think is like the EU specifically, besides the funding withdrawal and these controls, what the EU can do to try to influence Hungary or Poland or other countries like this, or protect its institution from other countries backsliding into illiberal democracy or populism.
Unlike other people, I believe that the EU cannot do very much other than supporting Hungarian society and the Hungarian liberal opposition. Why the EU cannot do that much? Because in the treaties of the European Union, it is clearly said that the country members of the European Union have to be democracies. And we like it or not, right? Hungary is a democracy. And this is what Orban says. And he has reason to say that. And the European Union cannot say that, Hungary is not a democracy. One thing that the European Union, and now let me say something that it will be kind of bold, perhaps. I think that what the European Union could do in the future is to change the treaties and define the treaties that the country members of the European Union have to be liberal democracies and not just democracies. In that case, you can do a lot about Hungary and about the behavior of Hungary, because Hungary is not a liberal democracy. Okay? Because right now, Orban goes and tells the European Union that, look, guys, I mean, according to the Treaty of what was that, Lisbon, we're a union of democracies, and I am a democracy because the elections are free, because the opposition, I mean, they ran in free elections, they lost, they admitted their defeat, and we're a democracy. But it's not a liberal democracy.
Yes, sir. Then.
Okay, I have the following question. Like my understanding, how these populistic tensions could rise up. Actually, that could be indeed the response to the liberal programs, in the sense that, okay, in many of those societies, before liberal ideas come in, there are certain groups which have certain status. Yeah. So, and when there is more liberalism, then in a certain way they feel that their privilege, their status is being undermined. Yeah, is being diluted, and after some time, there's some kind of backlash against that. So it's like it's natural. So of course it's not right. This is not the society people want to build. People want to build society on merit. Yeah, but actually with that there is also certain problems in my opinion. But like, if you want to build society on merit, of course all these privileges, they should be taken away. But as these liberal ideas permeate, certain groups start feeling that their positions are diminished, and that's why they hear populism and it appeals to them. So I don't know, what do you think?
What is the question?
So yeah, so the question is that in a sense, do you think that these populist ideas are actually created by liberalism itself?
Populist ideas are they created? Well, liberalism, like any other system, creates its own problems. Democracies create their own problems, and so on and so forth. But what happens here, when you examine, as I've done, all of those societies which turn from liberal to illiberal, what you will see all the time, you will see a leader, an individual leader, who acts as a symbolist. They have great symbolic power. They use words, images, visions, okay? And they built an idea of society. I mean, I don't know if you listened to Donald Trump yesterday at his, message. They project an idea of society which is split between two groups, okay? The people versus, them versus us, an in-group versus an out-group, etc., etc. And they project an idea of society as being in a crisis. The American Carnage, for example, okay? This is what Trump did yesterday. I mean, I watched him. Oh my gosh. And people are convinced by that. So this idea of society is what people see after that, because it is projected onto them. There's nothing magic here, okay? It's not magic. There's nothing. It is leaders who project an idea of society, and people vote for that leader. And he's because that leader promises to work for the interests of the people, okay, irrespective of institutions and institutional legality. So that leader never talks, okay, to the people in the name of institutions. They talk in the name of democracy. They talk in the name of majorities, but not in the name of institutions, okay, which should be equal for all. So you have to think about individual leaders acting, about agency. So you have two levels of analysis here. You have the structural level, societies, and how societies are and how politics have come to be up to this day, and you have agency. And you have an interaction between structures, societies, okay, crisis, the economy, society, politics, and agency. So you have to think about those two things and how those two come together. In a liberal democracy, agency doesn't matter, because you have leaders who abide by the institutions, right? So leaders may change, but the institutions remain the same. In a populist democracy, the leader comes on a promise that he, and it's always he, in most, well, okay, promises to even violate the institutions for serving the interest of his own supporters, the people, okay, at the expense of the opposition most of the times.
We have room for one more question coming. No, sir, I'm sorry. I need to have it circulated among people in the audience. So one question coming from the online discussion. Does your theory consider an ideal type of democracy? How does democracy, according to your conceptualization, stand in relation to an ideal?
That's a good question. No, it is a formal idea of democracy, the one that that I have at the basis of my theory and my conceptualization. But I consider as a realistically ideal democracy, or whatever comes closer to an ideal liberal democracy, as it happened in the Western world after 1945. I mean, that is the closest to an ideal of a democratic type that we have. Okay, and we have liberal democracies. I mean, many democracies have been liberal for so many years, so many decades. That is the ideal. So, but other than that, I'm talking about democracy as a method, essentially, of electing your own government and as a process of running your own country. Okay, as being an elected government.
Wonderful. Well, it's already 1 p.m., so I'm afraid we will have to stop now, but I know there will be some discussion continuing in the room for those of us who are in person. I had other question, in fact, and let me just launch that as an element, not for you to answer, but of the discussion, is that we are looking at kind of typology of political regimes, in a sense, but there are many other things that are involving the way the society is functioning that are not directly political and institutional. And so one of the questions I would have for continuing the discussion outside of this seminar would be, how do we integrate, for example, the corporate world and the way the corporate world is influencing our life and our politics and our institution? How would that fit in the definition of, for example, liberal democracy may have strong corporate institutions that are illiberal? So I'm just kind of launching or provoking.
The answer is disarmingly simple. You build a new typology, which is not, I mean, you may build many typologies, right? Yeah. It depends on the questions that you pose in the beginning. So you build another typology, and which addresses different questions or similar questions. So
perfect. So work to do. I wanted to thank you, all of us, for being with us both in person and online, and a big thank you thanks to Takis for being with us at the Illiberalism Studies Program and launching this really fascinating discussion. And we are waiting for the publication related to that new project. So thank you once again. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you very much.
Takis for today. And our next seminar of the Illiberalism Study Program will be in December 1st, and we'll be continuing discussing with this time a roundtable of 3 scholars about the kind of theoretical assumption of and theoretical concept going around illiberalism, especially with a kind of more historical perspective this time. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you soon.